I am so honored to be with you here today on Treaty 1 territory. I live and work on the boundary of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territory, the ancestral homes of the Dakota, the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Assiniboine. My home and where I work is powered by hydroelectricity from north of Manitoba in Treaty 5 territory, and we understand and are aware of the damage that that has been causing to northern Manitoba communities. So I want to honor that here today as well. The talk I'm going to give is called Untangling, the Treaty 5 Adhesion. It's a set of documents that I have been looking for a long time and hadn't been able to find. I have hard copies here for people to see afterwards, and I can also email you the attachments as well if you want to look at them later. I want to acknowledge my role in the treaty making process. I am a settler. My great-grandparents, who actually lived long enough for me to know, arrived here in 1874 and were part of the treaty-making decades that began in the 1870s. This is the treaty that my people signed with the government. It's called the Privilegium. We were put onto two reserves, one the East Reserve, which is now sort of Steinbach area, and the West Reserve, which is Altona-Winkler area. The treaty that my great-grandparents signed gave us access to land, gave us the freedom to worship and live a spiritual life in the way we wanted, gave us the right to speak our own language, and gave us the right to be educated in our own language. I might have never understood what that meant and the privilege that was, except when I was a child, my parents gave me the greatest gift ever when they moved us to the community of Pangashi. It wasn't a First Nations yet. It was a small community that lived on their own territory. They lived outside of reserve land, and they were deliberately doing that in order to maintain their own way of life. Pangashi has become well known because of the drum created by Namiwan. This is his son, Wanashens. He passed away in 1968, and my family moved into his house. My father ran a nonprofit cooperative trading post that was requested by the community to come and be an alternative to the Hudson Bay Company. So the money made from the store every year, little bits of it, all went back to the community per person. This was the home we lived in. And I might have never understood what my treaty signed with the government, the way in which it privileged me until I lived on Treaty 5 territory at Pangashi and went to school where people were, or where my friends, the kids, were not allowed to speak their own language in school. They were not taught to read and write in Anishinaabe. And the contradiction between my privilege and theirs became very clear. So the teachings that I have from that time of living there and speaking the language there, I hope I can honor that time and those teachings in the work I do now. As you can see here, the Privilegium was actually written in the language of my great-grandparents, so they could actually read it. All the treaty records I have read related to Treaty 1, Treaty 2, all the way through Treaty 5, all of them are in English, right? Rather than the language that the communities could speak. So here you see that contrast, right, between them. What I'm going to share with you today is a set of records that I found I've been looking for a long time for documents related to the adhesion in northern Manitoba. It's always been something that nobody really talks about a lot. Treaty 5 is talked about, some of the other treaties are talked about, but there's been sort of this fog around what was actually going on with the adhesion process. And I couldn't find a lot of sources, and I've been looking and looking and looking. Finally, for some reason, I found this set of 3 documents. They're part of a file called the RG10 files. And there's 3 separate files that I have here that you can look at in person. I'll go through the documents, and what I want to do is demonstrate the timeline of evidence as it exists in the documentary evidence. I'm clearly just going to be going through some of the main pieces because there's over 800 pages. I don't have time to talk about it all. I don't want you to get too hung up on the dates. Dates are always kind of a love-hate thing for all my students in history. They were like, do I really have to remember when this happened? I think of dates as clothespins on a wash line. They're important moments. They hold the clothes. The story is the clothing, not the clothespins, right? So the dates are like clothespins on a wash line that connect and hook things together. The important information from these dates is the clothing, is the why. Why did that date matter? How does this happen? So don't get too overwhelmed by the dates, and think more about what's happening in between all of these dates and what's going on. My sense is that in the RG10 files, the answers to a lot of the questions around Treaty 5 adhesion, the answers are in there. Some of this information will be familiar to some of you and many of you. Others might find it new. I want to be clear that I did uncover some documents that could be somewhat upsetting, and I'll give you a warning as to when I come upon those. Overall, all these documents show us that it was the Indigenous communities themselves who were initiating the adhesion requests. Once Treaty 5 had been signed in 1875, it was the people north of that of that boundary that started initiating those requests immediately. The government had very little interest in that. Furthermore, that boundary is very unclear. And so there's a lot of confusion for the government, for the documents, within the documents themselves, within communities themselves, over what's really going on with these boundary lines. So in the 1870s, this is the place of Manitoba at the time. The primary reasons we're going to see that people and communities asked for treaty was about 2 or 3 primary issues. One is they wanted to enter into relationship with the Queen as on par with Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, and then the broader Treaty 5 documents. They wanted access to health care. They wanted education, and there's multiple requests for schools to be built in the communities, being taught in their own language. It's very clear. They don't want it in English, they want it in their own language. And they want to share in the resources of this new country after 1867 alongside their peers, other Indigenous communities. So the first few slides I will just show you will highlight how many times, this is what's in the documents. There might be many more requests than actually exist that are in the documents. But this is how many times people are asking for treaty in what is now sort of northeastern Manitoba. So here's some of the first petitions. As early as 1 year after 1875 Treaty 5, people from Oxford House are officially requesting to be a part of this treaty. York Factory, 1876, they also want to be a part of this. 1877, there's another request from York Factory as well. In 1878, somebody by the name of Peter Walker from Oxford House arrives at Island Lake to meet with Manachiman to discuss treaty. So Oxford House and Island Lake are coming together, organizing together to talk about treaty and what they can do. Here, I just showed some of those documents so you can see what some of them look like. This is actually from the Hudson Bay Company. The factor at Island Lake is actually recording what's happening and talking about some of this. In August of 1878, 2 canoes from Island Lake leave for Oxford House, expecting to hear about the treaty that's going to be made with them. So there's always an expectation that treaty is going to be made very quickly. In 1880, the first formal request again from Oxford House is signed by somebody named Daniel Belton. Now, that is clearly an English name given to him. And here he says in his petition, "We are poor, we have nothing to sell except for what is except fur, which is becoming scarce." And this is something that in all the Hudson Bay Company records I've been reading, fur as a trading commodity is becoming very, very scarce. There is food, there's fish, there's rabbit. That escalates and then de-escalates over the years. But for the most part, there is food sources. But there is the fur that they're trading has become much, much less abundant. So here, this person is asking to be placed into treaty. Now, the response is right below that. And this is what's going to happen over and over and over again in every case when treaty is requested. And this letter was actually marked confidential. So it wasn't supposed to be something everyone saw. This letter said, any good reason for a treaty at Oxford House would be applicable to the Indians at York Factory and in fact all the northern communities where the country is equally unadapted for settlement. The Oxford House Indians have excellent fishing grounds and are as well off as any throughout the north. In other words, the government was not at all interested in making treaty if the land wasn't good for settlers, my great-grandparents, right? So they wanted settlers, and other than that, they weren't interested in making treaty at all. And they say this over and over and over again. Here you can see that's the record of that letter saying we have no interest in making treaty at this time with anyone. Communities continue to ask for treaty. It doesn't matter how many times the government says no, communities keep asking for treaty. And so one thing that's very clear from all these documents, if it wasn't for the tenacity, the perseverance, and the strength of the leadership within each of these communities, it would have just fallen off the government's interest. But instead, they kept putting it out, making formal requests so that the government had to keep paying attention to what was going on. Here we see in 1881, 1884, and from both Nelson House and York Factory are continuing to request treaties. In June of 1885, Chief John Howry and William Isbister from Nelson House asked for treaty. And this is what becomes clear in these documents. By the mid-1880s, outsiders are coming into the region, not just Hudson Bay Company traders and a few Métis traders, but outside commercial fisheries, outside people who want to settle and look at the land and see what's available. So there's starting to be great concern on the part of the northern communities that they're not in treaty, they have no protection, and these outsiders are coming in and starting to interfere with their resources. The fishers, particularly, are very concerned. In July of 1885, Magnus Harper from Island Lake formally requests treaty again for all of Island Lake and states that he represents about 350 people. Here is the letter that he has somebody write for him, and then he sends it off. The Superintendent General responds to these requests. And again, as is clearly stated here, this area is not wanted for settlement by whites, and the Indians can continue to live by hunting and fishing. So if nobody else wants the land, we are not going to make treaty. So they keep repeating this over and over again. Every time they say no, they also say, well, but if the need arises, we'll think about it and consider it. So it's just a very clear pattern that exists throughout this time period. On July 1st, 1891, Chief John Wood from Island Lake once again requests treaty for the people at Island Lake and declares that it's important that they have treaty at Island Lake and not at Oxford House or Norway House, because oftentimes it's difficult to travel between those distances. And so they want treaty to be done. Here, John Wood says, the reason for treaty is we are very poor and we cannot help ourselves in any way. We want tools to build our houses, and we want the Queen to help us. Please let us know when you are going to be coming, and please do come to give treaty to this place. Bring the tools with you. I will tell you how many people that are at Island Lake. And I will tell you our place is very rocky. In other words, we're not going to be growing crops like in the South, but we want to participate in all of this. Once again, the response is January 1st, 1892. The country generally throughout that region is believed to be unproductive and unsuitable for settlement. No white settlement that the undersigned is aware of has ever taken place, with the exception of a few Hudson Bay Company employees and some missionaries and their families. So in other words, if outsiders don't want the land, we're not going to be part of this. So that denial is continually based on that particular issue. Again, throughout the mid-1890s, the Nelson House, Split Lake, Oxford House, and Trout Lake are all sending messages through missionaries, through Indian agents, through Hudson Bay Company factors who communicate with the outside. Please, we want to make treaty during this time. Something happens by the late 1890s that starts to change the government's perspective. So this is a really clear shift. In 1897, somebody by the name of the Jabez William Mining Act of the Dominion for Keewatin at Lac Seul in Ontario, which is now Ontario, says, wait a minute, you keep blowing off all these requests for treaty, but actually the land is very valuable and has a lot of mineral resources. So you should rethink why you want to make treaty. So they move from, oh, nobody else wants to live there, so we won't make treaty with anyone, and they start to shift the conversation. And here you can see this person raises the issue, and what they're very clear is, Indian title has not been extinguished yet, which is what they're concerned about, right? So They talk about the issue of mining and the natural resources, and that treaty needs to be something to consider. So all of this is probably, oh, and here they have a little, they add a little map of the region where you can see this is part of what we would now call northeastern Manitoba, western Ontario, and they're talking about the wealth of the land. Here's a part of the story that I did not expect to find, and I want to apologize if this causes you harm or pain. I do not intend to do that. I believe that everyone needs to know the truth within the documents, and that empowers. Once you know the whole story, that empowers you, right? So in the middle of this, you know, document after document talking about treaty requests, the denial by the government, what's going on, I've uncovered another set of documents within all of this. This is a story of a person named Fred Stevens. He's part of the Methodist Missionary Society, and he had been going to different communities and spreading Christianity and getting to know many different communities. In the late 1890s, in fact, 1897, he decides and sends a letter to this person here by the name of Clifford Sifton, who is the Minister of the Interior, and says he has a plan to forcibly relocate everybody from York Factory, Churchill, Split Lake, God's Lake, Oxford House, Island Lake, right, the whole northeastern part of north of the boundary of Treaty 5. The reason he says this should be done is that there was, he's increasingly concerned about the hardship of living on the land, and that people should be relieved of that kind of hardship. I will put this up here so you can see. This is the letter I'm reading from. He says, the place which I would propose as suitable for a colony, he decides that everyone's just going to come, move into a new space, is along the west shore of Fisher Bay on southern Lake Winnipeg, opposite of Moose Island. There is found land suitable for splendid farms on a small scale, and there's plenty of hay for at least some time to come. So he, without consulting people who live at Fisher Bay in that region, right, comes up with this plan. Now, it would be somewhat comical if Indian Affairs didn't take him seriously and decide that wasn't such a bad idea. So, over the next several years, Fred Stevens is constantly petitioning Indian Affairs to forcibly relocate the northern communities. Now, Indian Affairs says, well, this is a bit odd because nobody north of Treaty 5 at this point is part of treaty, so we have no jurisdiction over them. We can't make them do anything, right? So this is, they are living on their own land in their own way, and we can't force them to do anything. So ironically, because northeastern Manitoba at this time, the whole territory in the area, is not part of the Indian Act, which has been imposed on communities, they're actually don't have any jurisdiction to forcibly move people, but they wanted to. This is really the shocking piece of all of that. Fred Stevens does not take no for an answer, and he continues to petition Indian Affairs to get this process underway. He talks to people at Oxford House and presents a letter, which I have here shown, that says everybody's on board. Everyone's ready to go. I think this would come as a surprise to everyone living at Oxford House that this was going on, because they did not have any idea what was going on. So we have no idea what that conversation was about and how it happened, but he claims that everything he is saying is, he's speaking on behalf of all the community at Oxford House, and that they all want to move. Where this becomes, and the reason I raise this as important, and I'm sorry if this is a painful piece of the story, I physically felt sick for days after reading this through, is Fred Stevens gets into relationship with John Semmons. Now, John Semmons ends up being the person negotiating Treaty 5 adhesion in 1908, 09, and 1910. John Semmons has started the Brandon Residential School in 1898, right? He's a Methodist missionary. He starts the school. And so he and Fred decide that this would be a really great idea to do together. And so they decide, the letters just become really appalling, and I will spare you some of the details, because the way they talk about moving communities and moving people around and taking children and just removing them from their families is really, really painful and sickening to listen to. The reason I tell this story is that John Semmons, who becomes the negotiator for Treaty 5 adhesion, is part of this story, right? And so even though he presents himself later during treaty negotiations as, somebody who's negotiating in good faith, in actuality, he's been, this has been something that he thought would be a really good idea. So it's a very difficult time period. Indian Affairs continues to sort of push back on this plan, saying we have no jurisdiction to do this, and we're actually not sure people really want to move. On top of that, they get reports from the Hudson Bay Company, people who work in the communities, who say, things aren't nearly as bad as what Fred Stevens is saying it is. We're not quite sure why he's talking about everyone starving, everyone, he talks about all the northern communities will be exterminated due to the lack of food and the hardship and everything else. He really becomes, he puts out notices in the Free Press and in Winnipeg saying everything is dire, everything's, bad's going to happen unless people get moved over. So ironically, the Hudson Bay Company folks actually are working against all of this. Here you see John Semmons suggesting that the land around Fisher Bay be set aside for the children, that once they leave Brandon Residential School, having been forcibly removed from their parents, that they could then start a colony. I mean, it's really outrageous what is going on. Interestingly enough, Indian Affairs asks John Semmons and Fred Stevens how they have the authority as Methodist missionaries to be forcibly removing children at all, since everyone they are moving is not in treaty territory. People are living in their own communities on their own land. So the government actually asks them how they have any right to do this at all. And so what eventually happens is this whole thing seems to kind of die down to some extent, And one of the people that helps to do this is another Methodist missionary named John McDougall. And he actually grew up as a missionary kid, and he spoke Cree and Anishinaabewin before English. So he's very connected to the communities. He speaks the language fluently. And so he talks to people and says, people don't have any interest in moving at all. Who are you talking about? What's going on, right? But it's this whole dynamic between them. And so he's sort of, he's really sticking up for them on some level. So I'm trying to, how much time do I have here still? Am I close to running out? Okay. So I will move ahead. So between John McDougall and the Hudson Bay Company, they decide that this is not going to be something that's helpful. But you see the complicity of these missionaries in their ideas about being part of Canadian society and as Christians, right? And so that complicity between those two viewpoints is very much behind a lot of this kind of thing. John McDougall ends up marrying Henry Bird Steinhauer, who was a very well-known person during the 1800s. He ends up marrying his daughter, and it's a really interesting piece of all of that. So I will move ahead to, so the petitions keep coming. The government keeps saying no. In 1903, John Simmons, who has tried to be part of this forcible relocation project, gets appointed Indian agent for the Keewatin district. And here you see a missionary or bishop of Keewatin, Fox, who is advocating on the behalf of the Split Lake community, saying more and more people are coming onto Nelson River. They're fishing, they're interfering with traditional hunting territory, they're tapping resources that the community needs and uses for fishing and hunting. And so they're trying to make treaty. So here we are by 1904, this moves along. Indian Affairs is somewhat interested once in a while in what's going on, but doesn't really pay a whole lot of attention to this. 1906, Fox again says people at Split Lake want treaty. There is some question as to where Treaty 5 boundary, whether it includes Split Lake or whether it doesn't include Split Lake. In the meantime, as this ramps up, RCMP officers are now being sent into the communities, which is starting to cause concern, right? Why are they sending police into the communities when all we're doing is asking for treaty, right? So there is some concern about that, as one can imagine. By 1907, the desire for treaty has become extremely clear, and the government appears somewhat ready to enter into treaty with the Split Lake community. First of all, here's where it gets really ugly again. Not only do they not know where Treaty 5 boundary is from the original 1875, they are concerned that if they sign new communities into the treaty, that they will then be forced to pay arrears. So if you sign in 1907, but treaty was made in 1875, every person is owed all that money every year between those 2 years. So they explicitly say, if we make treaty with communities, we will not pay any of those arrears. Now, let's keep in mind, these communities are never more than a couple hundred people in each of these places. Treaty 5, the annuity is $5, And the people that come up to make treaty are getting paid $100 a month. So they're worried about $5 per year, but they're paying negotiators $100 a month, right? So that just gives you a sense of, so they can't decide if they're going to make a new treaty or stick with Treaty 5 adhesion in northern Manitoba. Here you see the map where the line goes up to Split Lake. It appears to encompass Split Lake itself, but not their hunting and fishing territory. And that's what really becomes an issue, right? Because Split Lake says, well, that's fine if our community's in it, but what about all our territory that we need to protect from outsiders who are coming in? So John Semmens actually describes the traditional territory on a document here. And it'd be really interesting to show this to the community to see, how accurate this actually is, or whether he's just kind of making stuff up as he goes along. So as late as 1907, the government says, no, we still don't want treaty. And if we do pay treaty, no arrears of annuity payments will be made whatsoever. So I keep going through this. John Semmens tells everybody at Split Lake and Nelson House that the government's trustworthy and they can, base all of that on there. Even in 1908, they are still saying no to treaty. Throughout all of this. And here's where it gets really interesting. The documents talk about two treaties, and I've heard lots of people talk about the issue of Treaty 10 and Treaty 5. And there's lots of conversation around, well, we thought we were going to be part of Treaty 10, and it turns out we were part of Treaty 5. The reason the government, from all the records I've been able to find, and we can look at them a lot more carefully, is that Treaty 10 was a lot more it paid a lot more in arrears or annuity payments. So it was $12 instead of $5. So the government didn't want people to join Treaty 10 because it was more expensive. It also assured people more land because Treaty 10 was designed for non-agricultural communities, so people living in the bush. So it was designed for bush communities, not for southern, Treaty 1, Treaty 2 kinds of territories. So right until the end of Treaty 5 in 1908, they bring both treaties with them, Treaty 10 and Treaty 5, and what the documents say is that if you can't get them to sign Treaty 5, then we'll give them Treaty 10. But don't tell them. We'll give them Treaty 5 first and see if they go along with it. So what you're seeing here is a complete duplicity, right, of what's really going on between what's being said to people and then what's actually happening behind the scenes. I will be very, very quick to finish here. There was 800 pages. This is actually the short version of all the things that I found. It's discovered in 1909 that the wrong treaty was signed with Split Lake, and Split Lake actually signed a treaty that had a lot more territory to it, but that was never talked about with Split Lake. That was only talked about internally. That's something for the policy and legal analysts to take a look at to see what is going on there. Here you see Split Lake is giving up a lot more, quote unquote, giving up a lot more of their territory than what they initially signed on to. The other issue related to Treaty 5 adhesions in 1909, here you see John Semmens. One thing that my dear research partner, who has since passed on, Norman Wood of Garden Hill, always said, I want to know who are the signatories on all these treaties. So these documents actually tell us who these signatories are. And it turns out if you wanted to go on the treaty expedition, you could ask to go along and they would just let you. It didn't matter that you had any legal experience or knew anything or whatever. So you have somebody named H.S. Stead who worked for the Winnipeg Free Press who wanted to go along. He thought it'd be interesting. The person beneath him is his wife because she wanted to go on a trip. She becomes a legal signatory to Treaty 5 Adhesion in 1909 because she's along for the trip. Walter Ross is a doctor who goes along. He, again, asks whether he can come along, and they say, sure, so he goes. Barbara Ross is his wife, his partner. So she signs onto Treaty 5 Adhesion, right? There's no... Charles Isbister has a little bit of authority in the community. He's actually part of the Hudson Bay Company. But these other folks are all people that request to come along and are just there. I haven't found out all the other people for God's Lake. Some of them are the same, but and Oxford House, some of them are the same, but I haven't found all the names to all of them yet. What's really important about the 1909 treaty adhesion is that when they get to Oxford House and Island Lake, they realize that everyone is really sick. There's a flu epidemic going through. So here you can see the documented cases at Oxford House, at God's Lake. I mean, we're talking dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And at Island Lake, John Simmons says, every single person is ill. There isn't a single person who is well. So that's the context of these treaty conversations. Everyone is desperately ill at the time. Another piece of the story that has often come up is why did the treaties get signed with X's when we know people in these communities were all fluent, written and oral in syllabics, right? Well, the originals that are not published have syllabics. People sign them in syllabics, not the X. So what becomes public is the X, which then sort of continues this idea that people are illiterate, right? In English, anyway. But instead, they're actually reading and writing in syllabics, and they're signing in syllabics. So that's another big issue that comes up. So I will end there. I know I'm way over time, but these documents, I think, are extraordinarily important to give a much deeper understanding of what is going on during this treaty-making adhesion process. And I have hard copies if you want to look at them. I also will give you any of the files. If you give me your email number, I can just send you the PDF files because they're all public record and available to anyone who wants to use them. And I will let the policy analysts and the legal scholars who know a lot more, I'm a historian, really play with these. But this is a really critical issue that has created a lot of questions around treaty itself. Okay, thank you very much.